Just, I suppose, to keep things on track for this evening, tonight's topic is the problem with carbon offsets. So we're going to hear from Stephen Long in a second, and then that'll followed by Q&A. So just sort of introducing Stephen. I know this is a topic that is of interest to a lot of people in our group, and comes up a lot in the various discussions we have. So it's great to have a session really purely focused on it. So introducing Stephen. Stephen is a senior fellow and contributing editor at the Australia Institute, has been with them since November last year. Prior to this, he worked for over 21 years at the ABC, most recently as a reporter for Four Corners. And interestingly, he did a Four Corners episode on carbon offsets as well. Stephen spent 5.5 years at the ABC as a senior reporter investigations, part of the business reporting team. He was also the ABC senior economics journalist for 10 years and a senior reporter for 7:30 as well. Prior to the ABC, Stephen was a senior reporter and opinion columnist for the Australian Financial Review, writing on industrial relations, work and labour markets. So, Stephen, thanks so much for joining us, and over to you.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Carolyn, and very nice to be here with you all. I'd just like to acknowledge that I'm coming to you from the lands of the Wangal people and paying my respects to the Indigenous owners of the land, their elders, past, present and emerging. I was chatting beforehand, I noticed Gillian Corbin there, who I think works with my good friend Amanda Blair. And Amanda said to me, oh, we have carbon credits. We use offsets because we bring some material across from overseas, I think New Zealand, and so we offset that. And that's all fine. That's all well and good. And I'm not discouraging people from taking those steps to try to offset emissions that they're making and what they do, or signing the little thing on your ticket option, online ticket option, that says you could buy an offset. But on a bigger scale, the problem is that offsets more at the corporate level are delaying climate action. What we need to do for climate change is, as far as possible, reduce emissions at source. We've got to cut those fossil fuel emissions and get them down as low as we can before we look at any form of offsetting. And then as a society, we need to decide what we're going to continue to do and offset that. The problem at the moment is that offsets globally and in Australia are actually being used to expand production, transport and burning of fossil fuels. There are also serious integrity questions about a lot of offsets and the extent to which they represent genuine emissions reductions. And bogus offsets that don't represent genuine emissions reductions are being bought by big greenhouse gas emitters. So then you get a double whammy where you're continuing to make emissions, a business is continuing to make emissions, or even expanding emissions on the basis of offsets that aren't real. Now, this is a problem here and overseas. The first thing I want to get clear is that offsetting itself doesn't reduce the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. The whole logic of the offset is that someone is buying a carbon credit to offset what they're doing so that they can keep emitting or emit more greenhouse gases. All the credible evidence says that to avoid catastrophic climate change, the world must phase out fossil fuels and certainly stop greenlighting new coal mines and gas developments and oil developments, but we're expanding fossil fuels using carbon offsets as an excuse. And so we need to get to that core reduction, not merely offsetting. Now, you might have heard of the safeguard mechanism, and I'm presuming little knowledge. There'll be some of you there who perhaps have a lot of knowledge, but I'm presuming little knowledge and keeping things fairly simple. But tell me if yell if I'm just being too simple. But the safeguard mechanism is a linchpin of Australia's climate action policy, and it applies to more than 200 businesses, our biggest emitters. And now, it's been around for a while in one form or another. Under the coalition, there were serious problems with it. It's got a bit better under the current government. The good thing is it ratchets down progressively the amount of emissions that those large emitters can make over time. Though I have to say there are some get-out clauses that you could drive a Big Mac truck through. So exporters don't have to reduce as much. It's just under 5% a year in general, but if you're in a trade exposed export business, it gets lower. There's lots of little things like that. But the worst thing is it allows companies to rely 100% on carbon offsets to meet their emissions reductions targets. So there's no actual requirement that a business is actually cutting the production of fossil fuels or it's cutting its emissions at source. They can rely 100% on offsets. And we're one of the few developed countries in the world that actually allows that complete reliance on offsets. I'm told actually that it's only us in the developed world and Kazakhstan. So we're up in good company, Yakshimash, with this. And the credits that are used, so the offsetting is done by buying carbon credits. For our big emitters domestically, the only permissible offsets under the safeguard mechanism, it's a bit more relaxed for other businesses, but under the safeguard mechanism, they're currently only allowed to offset by buying Australian carbon credit units, or ACCUs as they're commonly known. Now, you might think, great, Australian carbon credit units overseen by government, they must be all hunky-dory. I'll get to that in a moment. It's not the case. There's actually quite serious integrity issues that have been raised with our homegrown carbon credits. But just to backtrack a little and make the point about the way offsets are being used to maintain or expand fossil fuel production. I don't know if you saw in The Guardian or elsewhere today, there was a report that the WA government is about to approve a 50-year extension of Woodside's huge gas plant in the northwest of WA at the Burrup Peninsula. And that plant and its extension is linked to the development and exploitation of at least 3 huge export gas fields that will enormously increase greenhouse gas emissions around the world. They're going to make the battle to combat climate change a lot harder. Now, the state government there's been an appeals process. The EPA, the Environment Protection Agency in WA, they have their own state-based agency, initially approved this, but there was a huge backlash. It went on appeal, and there are a couple of reasons for that. One is there is this spectacular Indigenous rock art, which is ancient and is in danger because of the gas development, which creates acidification, which can destroy the rock art. But beyond that, the concern is the massive fossil fuel emissions, greenhouse gas emissions associated with this. So there was an appeal process that was going on over that. The government's about to shut that down and legislate to stop it. And the basis of which they're doing that is that, oh yes, but this will all be covered by the safeguard mechanism. And so all of the emissions will be offset. Well, 2 things there. As I've explained, they don't actually have to, it's very, very difficult in that industry. Carbon capture and storage is the holy grail, but it's so far largely failed. There's an existing carbon and capture and storage facility in WA, and it's never operated at proper capacities, and it's very expensive. So, hey, offsets. The problem here is too, the safeguard mechanism only deals with emissions made in Australia. It doesn't deal with the massive amount of greenhouse gases that will be emitted in escaping emissions during the transport of this stuff overseas, but most importantly, when these fossil fuels are burnt in export markets in China, in Korea, in Japan, we'll have to rely on those countries putting in place their own offsets, perhaps. And the problem is, although we have domestic accounting for this stuff, and you could say, oh, they're buying offsets here to the extent that they work, and I'll get to that. And it's someone else's responsibility to deal with the fact that their greenhouse gas emissions are being made when this stuff's exported and burnt, this fuel. The problem is that greenhouse gas emissions don't respect borders. They cause catastrophic climate change that will be felt around the world, including in Australia, including amongst our Pacific neighbours, where nations are facing a rising tide as sea levels come up and will destroy countries like Tuvalu. I've just spent time with young climate warriors, young climate activists this week from Tuvalu and Kiribati, and they face a future where their lands disappear if we don't reduce emissions. And so we've approved in the past few months 3 massive new coal mines, a whole lot of gas developments over the past year, and hey, no problem, we've got offsets. That's not how it works. And I'll come to one of the reasons why it's a problem, even in a technical sense. The climate scientist Bill Hare, highly regarded internationally, and his colleagues have done a whole lot of work which shows that in effect, the problem with carbon offsets in a technical sense is they're not permanent, whereas a fair share of the greenhouse gas emissions made by burning fossil fuels, well, they're not permanent, but they're close to it. So when we burn the fossil fuels, the theory and what you hear from people spruiking carbon credits is 1 tonne of carbon in a tree or captured in the soil equals 1 tonne of carbon emissions from burning fossil fuels, 1 to 1. The reality is that trees die and burn, carbon in the soil doesn't last forever, but a fair share of those carbon emissions will be there in 1,000 years, in 4,000 years, in 10,000 years, even 20,000 years. And so technically there's a mismatch between near permanent emissions and non-permanent offsets. The other thing is the integrity issues. Now, when I was at the ABC, I broke what was a pretty big story, and it got picked up pretty much far and wide, and it helped to prompt a government inquiry. And that involved a chap called Professor Andrew McIntosh from the Australian National University, who had been the head of the integrity body for carbon offsets that looked at the methods and worked out whether they were genuine, whether they had integrity. And when he was there, he found himself, to an extent, silenced, or he tried to stay within the tent and fight the battle within the tent, put it that way. After he left, he assembled a team that looked at our major Australian carbon credit unit methods, the carbon credits that are bought and used for offsetting. And what they found was that 80 to 90% of them didn't represent genuine emissions. Now, one of the biggest method, in fact, the biggest method, is something called human-induced regeneration. And that's where farmers, largely out in the rangelands, literally back of Bourke, west, out in the far west, in this really, really almost desert-like country where you've got scrub. That's where the carbon credits are being bought and made. And the idea there was that in this method, farmers stop cattle grazing on part of the land and maybe stop using chemicals that suppress growth, and you got forest. forest. Forest was defined pretty loosely. I went out there, and the forests aren't what you'd think of as a forest, but that was the idea. Now, Andrew McIntosh and his colleagues, a multidisciplinary team, looked at this, and they found that most of the increase wasn't due to what it was being attributed to at all, but the waxing and waning of rainfall, and it wasn't genuine. Now, our next biggest method involved, waste dumps, landfill, and waste dump landfill operators were getting paid to cap their emissions, and with some of the bigger plants, they were stopping the methane escaping and then using it to generate electricity. And what Andrew McIntosh found when he was there, and he was moving to knock this off when he was heading that integrity body, was that effectively what was going on was a form of double dipping. So for a start, some state and territories actually required them not to allow those methane emissions to be going up into the atmosphere anyway, yet businesses were still getting paid in the form of carbon credits. And with the ones generating electricity, for many of them, it was actually lucrative. They could make money. And we know what's happened with electricity prices, gone through the roof. They could make money by capturing the methane from the waste dumps and generating electricity. Plus, they received large-scale renewable energy certificates, but the industry was actually getting paid carbon credits as well. And then those carbon credits can be sold to someone else who maintains or increases emissions because, hey, this waste dump's doing a good thing, they're trapping methane. So you've got a classic double dipping scenario. And eventually a number of participants in the industry came out and admitted this publicly. And it's being reformed. In New South Wales, there was a scheme where farmers had permits which allowed them to clear land, but land clearing is actually pretty expensive, and a lot of this land was marginal. And the Australia Institute did research which showed there just wasn't enough bulldozers to clear all the land, that the farmers were getting carbon credits for not clearing. And a mate of mine, Jeff Thompson, another ABC journalist, had a look at this, and he went out to a farm out near Cobar and had a chat with the farmer, and he was saying how great getting paid these carbon credits was, getting paid for generating carbon credits. And he'd made so much money, from not clearing his land and doing this, that he bought the neighbour's farm and cleared that instead. So that is what's known as leakage, and it's one of the many problems that happen with carbon credits in practice. It can be technical, working out how much carbon is supposedly being saved, and internationally there's a whole lot of work which shows that often for instance, you get a forest overseas in the Amazon or somewhere, and they establish, there's a baseline threat of logging to this whole area, and you get overstatements of what the threat is. Or conversely, and I'll get to this, you get situations where there's actually logging going on, and because this stuff is happening in remote areas, it's not declared. There are so many issues. But getting back to that farmer who made a whole lot of money by not clearing his land and getting carbon credits for doing so, and then bought the neighbour's farm and cleared that instead. So no net benefit in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. He's actually a poster boy for the industry and an example of regulatory capture. The Clean Energy Regulator, which ultimately oversees all this, it has on its website, well, I'm not sure if it still has, but not that long ago, and when I was doing my stories, had a series of videos up on its website that it made in conjunction with the lobby group for the carbon markets industry and some of the biggest players in the industry. And one of them featured this salt of the earth farmer out at Cobar. But I was staggered when I saw that. I mean, can you imagine ASIC or the banking regulator APRA doing warm and fuzzy videos with the Commonwealth Bank or Macquarie Bank. Macquarie Bank, who they did for problems in their brokerage about best practice in brokering. I mean, I found that really pretty amazing. And the chap I mentioned was replaced on the integrity body under the coalition under Angus Taylor by a guy called David Byers, who became its chair, who had spent a lifetime lobbying for fossil fuels. He'd been the head of the Gas and Petroleum Association, APPEA. He'd been deputy, and then I think after that acting head of the coal industry lobby group, and he'd worked for BHP as well. And he was heading up this integrity body, and they had another bloke on it called Brian Fisher, who is an economist who'd worked in government, but was infamous as not so much a climate change denier, but a minimiser, someone who was saying, well, we don't really need to do as much as we're told to offset this, and we certainly shouldn't hamper industry. And they commissioned a report looking into some of the stuff that McIntosh had raised. They commissioned it from a mate of Brian Fisher, but even that report found that nearly 40% of the farms in Queensland, which supposedly had this major carbon credits method, were claiming credits when the tree growth was actually static or going backwards. That report showed that, but the regulator didn't even look at that. They only looked at half a dozen examples or so that were directly referred to them as being, potentially fraudulent, and found maybe, it kept all this hidden, and they only eventually, when I was digging, talked about it, but found maybe one or two so they said there's no problem here. There's been a bizarre regulatory system that just speaks very much of the regulatory capture and the lack of integrity. Now, the government came in and they wanted to see lots of carbon credits generated because we're relying on carbon credits to offset pollution for our big emitters. And they commissioned a report which essentially said in the headlines, nothing to see here, there's no problem. But when you went through the body copy, it actually acknowledged a lot of the problems and is working away, and there's work being done to try to minimise them. And that's in Australia. Now, I want to take you to Papua New Guinea, where I went doing an investigation for Four Corners. We made a documentary called Carbon Colonialism, looking at some carbon offset projects there. And I'm just going to show you a little clip before I get to it, if I can get this to work. Wish me luck. Hold on, here we go. Share.
As we travel deeper into the rainforest, we come across a shocking scene. This is not what we expected to see. We asked our driver to take us up and show us the pristine rainforest. Now, there is rainforest here, but there's also utter devastation from logging within the Knight Carbon Credits project area that's meant to be saving the forests from deforestation. This is not villagers harvesting timber, this is commercial logging. What our cameras capture here has up until now been hidden from the world and from businesses that in good faith bought carbon credits from this project or are considering buying them. Knight concedes logging has been going on since June 2020. The logging we see appears to have been authorised by PNG authorities. Andrea Babin believes that if the scale of the logging were to escalate, it could compromise the integrity of the carbon credits.
They do not represent real emissions reductions. They're hot air. They're not worth the paper they're printed on.
Okay. Now, can you all still see me?
Yeah.
Stop share. Okay, great. Yeah, so that was a doozy of a trip. In many ways, it was quite a wild ride. I nearly died about 5 times crossing swollen rivers and going down roads that weren't roads and all sorts of things. But anyway, that project in PNG was being marketed by consultants under an Australian government program called Climate Active, and a whole lot of businesses, not massive businesses, but a whole lot of businesses bought carbon credits in good faith from that project to offset their emissions. And when we went there, what we found was there was extensive logging going on. And the tragedy is that what had happened is the company behind it, there were characters there who were essentially very aggressive. The guy running it was a big, sort of entrepreneur kind of guy, very aggressive salesman with a bit of a checkered history. And they overstated how much money and how many benefits people would be getting, didn't deliver. And so tragically, local villagers turned to loggers, Malaysian logging companies, and the logging started within that area. Now, for legal reasons, we had to say if the logging were to get worse, could compromise, and we can't say for sure it's compromised the value of carbon credits people have already bought, but it certainly is not what you want to see happening in an area that's meant to be protecting the forest. And in terms of the colonialism aspect of this, the guy running it had been done previously in the US, had been convicted in a civil case for fraudulently misleading investors, again by making false and misleading or bigged up, exaggerated claims. I actually found out after we put it to air that he'd had a prior criminal conviction as well, fairly low level, but again, some sort of financial fraud. And when we went to the quasi-regulator for this is all in what's known as the voluntary carbon market. And there's a mob called Verra based in Washington who oversee this market. And we went to them and asked what due diligence they'd done or required about the background of this guy. And they said, we don't need to, that's not our job. And then I think they realised their mistake, that was going to look pretty bad. So they came back later and said, well, of course we care, but someone's innocent to be proven guilty. And it's like, well, we've got the documents showing they've got a terrible background. Now you're dealing with vulnerable Indigenous people. I'm not saying this chap shouldn't be allowed to run a business there, but I would have thought you'd at least want to have a look at the background of the people involved as a quasi-regulator before you approved it. So there's that side of it. And then there's the out of sight, out of mind, and the lack of disclosure that this could go on for literally years without any published public documents highlighting it. So it's just a microcosm of what's happening in the wild west of this market, which is the voluntary carbon market internationally. Now, when I did this pretty much simultaneous with me doing that Four Corners story, The Guardian published an investigation which found that about 90% of carbon credits generated in the voluntary carbon market under this standard that the regulator I just mentioned oversaw were not genuine, were bogus, and prices in that market absolutely collapsed. Later, I got a broker's report saying that although prices had collapsed and there'd been concerns raised about integrity, there was still a healthy and thriving market for credits selling in the range of $1 US to $2, which is really next to nothing. So it seems that there's a market amongst some businesses who just want to say we're carbon neutral or we're net zero and buy credits without looking too closely about what's going on. Because if they're trading at that level and that price in a market with such known integrity issues, then you're really taking chances by saying that they're genuine. So to sum it up, we have problems with the fact that rather than reducing emissions at source, this stuff is being used to allow for an expansion of fossil fuel production. We've got problems that we're using non-permanent offsets for near permanent pollution, and we've got problems of integrity in the market. Now, I'm not saying there isn't a place for carbon offsets, but I think it should be a far more limited place than it is now. And again, it's delaying action. It's delaying the shift towards what we really need to do, which is bite the bullet, phase out fossil fuels, stop new fossil fuels, and work, even though it's expensive, as best we can to actually cut emissions. Real zero, not net zero, as Twiggy Forrest recently said. So I'll leave it there. I hope that was useful and really look forward to questions.
Thanks so much, Stephen. I hope everyone can hear me. If you can't, sing out. So that was really interesting, very clear sum up for us, Stephen. Thank you. If people have got questions, perhaps you could pop them into the chat. And we've got a couple of questions just to kick things off. The first one, Stephen, is offsets could work. Just yourself on mute.
Yeah, I just got you back there, Carolyn. I missed what you said before.
Any circumstances, ways that you can see where offsets could work?
I caught the end of that. Could I speak about circumstances where offset?
Yeah, any situations, Stephen, where offsets could work?
Yeah, so I come back to, I've got no problems with small businesses that are trying to do their best, or individuals buying offsets to reduce their emissions. It's really at scale where we're allowing major corporations to avoid the hard work of actually reducing emissions, and where we're allowing fossil fuel companies to do emissions. And there are projects that are working, but it's always suboptimal. It's always suboptimal. I would rather see, for example, forests preserved because of their innate value, both as carbon sinks, as sources of clean water, pure water purification for recreation. I'd rather see that happen without it being monetized to allow continuing climate emissions. So in my view, offsets are always suboptimal. Where can they work? There's some NGOs who are doing some good stuff in developing nations where they're distributing most of the gains to local people. They're setting up local industries, so cash crops in small sections of forest that are allowing people to gain an income. That stuff, has a role. But where they work is, in my opinion, where they're the end of the road, when they're the last resort, when we've done everything else we can do.
Yeah, that makes sense, Stephen. What about industries? Any thoughts about industries where there currently aren't abatement options? So, for example, solutions for green concrete don't yet exist. Any thoughts on how these types of organisations might be able to get to net zero?
Yeah, so I do acknowledge that this is a difficulty, and this is one of the rationales for having offsets, that there are some things as a society we determine we need to do, and the technology can be hard to get in place. That's true, and that is one of the reasons why we operate the safeguard mechanism, and we don't have green cement as of yet. It's right. Where the fine line is when do the carbon credits basically step in whilst we're developing better technologies that can allow us to do things we need to do in a clean way, and when do they actually deter? And one of the problems we've got at the moment is that, there are instances where the tech isn't there. and we still need to develop it. But there are other instances where it's just cheaper to buy offsets than do the hard work. And in the market at the moment, so for instance, I think the government did some work a couple of years ago and came up with a price at the time of, can't remember precisely, but $70, $75 a tonne was, the kind of carbon price we needed at that stage if we had a universal carbon price to try and hit our Paris goals. Now, the credits in our marketplace are trading at, the sort of $30 to high $30 level. So, only around half that. And you can buy, now the big emitters can't use it, but lots of other companies can. You can buy dead cheap offsets in the carbon market. So here's the problem. And yes, I do think as a society, we will reach the point, and we have reached the point in some areas where there's things we choose to do or need to do, and there's no other way to do that other than creating an offset. But we don't want incentives where the offset market becomes such a big business. And I tell you, it's a big business. There's companies valued in the hundreds of millions. It's a multi-billion-dollar market. We don't want a situation where the market is actually driving the schema, where we just move into offset land and we offset ourselves into oblivion.
Yeah, absolutely. So this question from Jacinta sort of follows on with that. So she's saying, to reach net zero, we need to both stop emissions and restoring and protecting nature. Unfortunately, companies are not going to do that out of the goodness of their own heart. If we reduce the scale of the carbon credit industry, how do you suggest we can get finance to restore nature at the scale we need and also help businesses transition?
So we live in an incredibly rich world, and we live in a rich country. And I heard a situation recently where Ken Henry said we needed $2 billion to create a nature repair market. Now, the government could take $2 billion and buy up a whole lot of land and actually preserve or regenerate carbon sinks without creating a market. What you've got to understand is a lot of what's being talked about, there is actually no natural market. You've got government stepping in to create a market. And in many cases, we'd just be better off for government to actually just save the bloody forests or regrow the forests. I'll give you another example of the perversity that can come out of this. I've done a lot of work on the Great Koala National Park in New South Wales. There was a big piece in the Herald, which I did my work a while ago, but it's great to see other journalists taking it up. But there was a piece today about the huge extent of logging within the proposed boundaries of that park. Well, just over a year ago, the New South Wales Premier admitted in a budget estimates hearing that they didn't want to put the national park in place until they had an Australian carbon credits unit method in place, because there was a huge market for the offsets. And if they locked up a national park now, they couldn't go back retrospectively and sell the carbon for offsets. And so, bizarre. And again, I'd rather see the logging stop. But if it's a choice between, do we declare a national park and find the funds to run that national park, or do we only declare the national park when we can monetize the carbon to create a license to pollute? I know which I'd rather do. So I think a lot of this comes down to choices. We're a rich nation, and we have a rich world, and we can actually generate ways of doing this that don't rely on generating often artificial markets and a whole lot of middlemen clipping the ticket along the way, because I can tell you that's a part of it. There's a lot of money to be made when you create artificial markets. There's less money when government just just does stuff like buys land, regenerates it, or pays others to regenerate land without requiring the quid pro quo that suits the fossil fuel industry.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for that, Stephen. What do you think are the, in terms of influencing change, what are the best ways do you think we can influence changing of people's thinking around carbon offsets?
So Richard Dennis from the Australia Institute is fond of saying repetition, repetition, repetition. And just keep talking about it until people get the message. But also, I think there is a lack of understanding around this. And I think, we do need to let people know the dilemmas and problems in this so that they can let politicians know. Because there are powerful vested interests, both people who stand to make money out of this market and the fossil fuel interests who don't want people to understand what's going on. So, this is all part of it. That's why I'll take every opportunity to talk about this, because I think it's important.
Yeah, absolutely. And
so politicians respond to pain is the small answer.
Yeah. And I mean, in terms of that, from a political point of view, I know some of the independent candidates, I know you've been working with some of them, haven't you, on this area as well? Do you want to just update on how that's going?
Yeah, I don't personally do, I've been on panels with a couple of the independents about this, but I don't personally do any lobbying as such. But I do know that there is concern amongst some of the independents. I know that there's concerns amongst Green senators and increasingly concerned. So in Australia, some of the major environment groups were brought into the tent by the current government. And, Chris Bowen's a very skilled political operator. And so they brought some of our biggest groups in, said, look, work with us. And that muted some of the criticism about what's happened with some of the ways we're going about things. But it was very encouraging that in July, 80 NGO, more than 80 NGOs from around the world signed a joint statement raising concerns about the growth of offsets and then becoming seen as a primary mechanism for dealing with emissions reduction, and raised all the issues that I raised here tonight, all the core issues I raised here tonight. And Climate Action Network Australia, which involves some of those large groups and represents a whole lot of climate NGOs, was a signatory to that. And so there's a growing awareness amongst global climate networks that there are real problems with carbon markets and with over-reliance on offsets. And we're starting to see even groups that had sort of delved a bit in this field becoming, or been reluctant to criticise too much, becoming more vocal.
Yeah. And in terms of the biggest abusers of the carbon offset schemes, is that the big mining companies, the Santoses of this world, people like that? Are they the?
Well, I guess we could call them abusers, but if the legislature and the parliament passes a system, which means they can do it, then they're going to do it. But look, what I think is really interesting is Woodside, for a couple of years in a row, has had a massive shareholder backlash, and they really struggled to get approval of their sustainability and environment report this past year. And part of that was concern about their emissions and concern about over-reliance on offsets. So big investors don't like this either, because they know there are a lot of, people in the market like it, and there are some better players and not so good players in the market. But there's a lot of big institutional investors who are wary of this. So that's another source of pressure.
Yeah, absolutely. And in terms of other commercialization options, if we don't employ carbon offsets, carbon trading, are there other things that can be done?
So are there other things that can be done? Well, there certainly are, and I'd have to sort of take that one on notice, but a lot of this, the way I look at it, is we often can't see the benefit of what we can do that doesn't have to involve commercialization. So that forest on the north coast of New South Wales and the mid-north coast of New South Wales is a classic example. We want to increase, well, governments want to increase population in Australia dramatically. There's going to be a lot of development in those areas. And the forests not only create clean air, they create clean water. And so there are a whole lot of intrinsic values that they have that are priceless, really. And we don't need to commercialize it. We just need to recognize the values that they're giving us in multiple ways, and say, well, that's a good enough reason to preserve those forests.
Yeah.
It's really interesting that behind the scenes that there's these, particularly with the Great Koala National Park, what's holding up the decisions. That they don't really say what's holding up the decisions, but it makes sense.
Well, there's two things. One is, the logging industry is powerful. They're represented by the CFMEU. The state-owned logging corporation is pretty much a rogue corporation that's been prosecuted for breaches so many times. But they're heavily influential. Those forces are heavily influential. That's one side of it. But the carbon side of it is fascinating as well. So they put in a method now that they're seeking approval for. But, I would hate it if it meant that we kept on delaying the park to the point where the integrity of that park is wrecked by the continuing logging incursions. And so, yeah.
Yeah. Do others have any questions they'd like to ask Stephen? Free to, Chris, feel free to speak up if you do. I was also just going to ask one more question about zero versus net zero. So if we don't employ, we recognise that the problems with carbon offsets, but we want to get to zero, not net, and we start talking about zero, not net zero. What are the big things? Obviously, you've talked about stopping mining fossil fuels. What are the other big things that really need to happen?
Oh, well, preserving forests and reforestation are two of the really big things that need to go on. We really, really do need to do that. Even in terms of net zero, the International Energy Agency put out a really interesting report. I think it was back in 2021, which runs through some of the things we need to do. But first and foremost was stop approving new coal, oil and gas developments, and then move to phasing out fossil fuels. And one of the problems we've got now is this kind of carbon offsets, fossil fuel industrial complex. We want the export income, and I'll just share this, which I think is quite interesting. Woodside commissioned research back in 2019 from the CSIRO, which they believed or hoped would show that their gas exports to Asia were actually a transition fuel and were pushing aside coal. And on the report that was eventually released after troublesome journalists requested it, found it under FOI, and that was about the 5th version. So obviously they'd done numerous drafts to try and assuage Woodside. But even that obviously sanitised draft said that in the absence of a high global carbon price, our exports of gas weren't displacing coal in China, Asia, China, Korea, Japan, Asia in general. They were delaying the transition to clean energy. And so, what else do we need to do? Well, I tell you what, I hope and pray a global carbon price. That's what it's a tragedy we lost the carbon price that we had in place here. But if we had a high global carbon price, it would deal with a lot of this.
That's really interesting. Thank you. I just wanted to, there's one more question in the chat, but I wanted to mention to everyone, thank you. Tim's added a couple of links that are really helpful. If anyone's interested in seeing Stephen's presentation to the Climate Integrity Summit, there's a link there, and also to your Four Corners show, there's a link of both of those in the chat for people. And I'll just read Donna Leah's question as well. The environment has no status in Australia and has been under-resourced for decades. The portfolio itself is considered the worst appointment for a minister. How can we make this a pain point?
Yeah, how can we make this a pain point? So, I really like Tanya Plibersek, but I think we've got to put a lot of pressure on her and hold her to account. But you're right. I mean, she was the next logical challenger for the leadership, and she's been handed the proverbial. So it's true, and it's interesting that climate and environment have been separated, and climate becomes an important portfolio, where blokes make decisions about technical matters, and environment has been subsided, but not letting them get away with it. So there was an interview in the Saturday paper recently with Tanya Plibersek, and in that she said we don't need a climate trigger in environment legislation because we have the safeguard mechanism. Now, that is the biggest crock I've ever heard. As I said, the safeguard mechanism only deals with domestic emissions. It's only phase 1, 2 emissions. Doesn't deal with all the emissions that we're exporting around the globe. But if you had a proper climate trigger, we could look at that. And the other possibility is, I know that this sounds a bit left field, but there was a landmark case in Queensland that was partly based on the Human Rights Act, where they found that Indigenous people in Queensland and Queensland citizens had a right to a future where the climate wasn't wrecked. It came out of the land court there, but it was a really fascinating judgment. And I think, we could try sort of mounting that. We have human rights not to live in a world that's being destroyed by climate change, and we need to advance that. But, politicians only respond ultimately to pain and the threat of pain. So, yeah, I didn't really give a good enough answer on how to create the pain points, but, yeah, we have to make this Tanya's issue, and we have to make it the government's issue. And, and again, that comes back to we've just got to get the public on board to say stop the fossil fuel developments. And you know what? What's interesting is powerful vested interests with big money hold big sway. But in the end, if enough people don't like it and vote for change, then change comes.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Stephen. It's just been such an interesting session.
Glad to be here. I enjoyed it. I hope people found it useful.
Yeah, it's been fabulous. Just before we finish, just a quick one. I mean, obviously, given the US election, I don't want to sort of veer off on a tangent here, but you got any comments or thoughts around, what things look like going forward due to that?
It's terrible news on the climate front because inevitably he will pull out of the Paris Agreement and international forums, and he kept saying during the campaign, drill baby drill. So he just wants more oil and gas and coal, and it's terrible for the climate. But then again, it might galvanize other nations, and look, sometimes you get shake-ups where there's short-term pain but long-term gain. The status quo in America hasn't been working for years. There's rampant inequality. People are dissatisfied, and it's hard to get people to focus on climate issues if they're feeling like, their day-to-day existences don't give them, a secure and meaningful life. So, maybe this lurch towards more the fascist end of the spectrum will mean that there's rebalancing, so that there's action on things that mean people have got the psychic space to deal with these issues in a country where it's rich, but there's a whole lot of people who manifestly just feel like they're not getting a fair share.
It was interesting at the election. I mean, climate didn't really feature in the US election at all, despite what they've done a lot of good things in the last four years.
Yeah. Well, that's another tragedy of all of this. There were a lot of problems with Joe Biden, and he stayed on too long. But he actually did some pretty good things with stimulating investment in clean energy. And one of the things he actually did was put a halt to new oil and gas exports because of, or gas in particular, as with growing evidence about escaping emissions and fugitive emissions from gas, and also, that's another side of it in terms of building coalitions on this stuff. There's a whole lot of it. Climate's really important, but fossil fuel developments also have air pollution effects and cause terrible health problems. And so we can form coalitions in terms of trying to deal with the climate action by teaming up with people who have concerns about health, clean air, lots of things. So look for allies, and what else are we going to do? We can't just lapse into ennui and despair. We've got to keep trying, eh?
Got to keep going.
Thank you. That's a perfect segue for our December.
I've just missed you again there, Carolyn. It's kind of gone on the weird mute again.
Yeah, can hear me. Oh.
Okay. Yeah, so we're just saying that that's a nice segue into our final session of the year. We've got Michelle Isles, who's the Chief Executive of Climate and Health Alliance. So we're going to look at the link between climate and health in December with her. So it just follows on from what you were just saying there, Stephen. So
excellent.
Yeah. But thanks so much. Thanks everyone for joining. Thank you, Stephen, so much for sharing. Great session today and all that knowledge, and really appreciate it. And I'm glad so many people could join as well. Great to see you all.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay. Farewell.
See ya.
Thank you.